Good morning and good afternoon. Welcome. Great to have you with us for this month's user group. So this month is all about unlocking the customer vault, and that vault, of course, is the customer data, data that you've captured over a period of time. So let's get into it and have a look what's on the agenda today. What are we talking about for the next 45 minutes? Obviously, welcome. Great to have you with us. Thanks again for making some time. Any questions that have been submitted will be covered and answered today. And then to help you look at ways to get more from your data, we're going to look at dynamic content and also segments, and specifically dynamic segments, in explaining what that means. Also, then going to share a principle, I suppose, or an idea around streams of communication, and then we'll move into how that's doable from the idea of a simplified persona and one question that you can ask to really help you develop that simplified persona. We do have some details in relation to release 24C, and of course, if there's any questions, please feel free to ask those as we move through. But I would like to make an acknowledgement of country, and that is to begin today by acknowledging the Gadigal people, the traditional custodians of the land on which we broadcast from today here in Sydney, and pay my respects to their elders past and present. I extend that respect to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples online with us today. So welcome, and of course, welcome everybody. Thank you again for making some time to be with us. So just some basic housekeeping for you. If you attend regularly, you know that we record our sessions on Zoom, and they're available on our blog. Please feel free to use the Q&A as we move through the session today. Adrian is online, so he'll be able to help me keep an eye on those. You can use the chat as well if you'd rather ask a private question. So keeping in mind that Q&A is visible to everybody that's on the call today. And there's an introduction. So my name is Derek Bell. I'm your host for today. And Adrian Jones, our CEO and founder, is also on the line. So thank you, Adrian, for joining us, and keep him busy with your questions, please. Okay, so there were no questions submitted this month, so I thought I'd just make a little reminder to let you know. You can submit questions at any time, and you don't need to forage around for a previous email in order to find that. If you simply type into your browser myeloqua.com, you'll arrive at the Eloqua user group homepage, and we can help you from there. So make sure you jump in and have a look at that. And please feel free to, as you think of a question, it may not be right before the webinar, that's fine. We collate all of those and we'll then answer them for you during the next live broadcast. So keep in mind, we're happy to answer those questions. So you might gather from the graphic that we're going to do a little bit of an Olympic theme today. Seems appropriate as we're celebrating the Summer Games. But dynamic content and segments. So last month, we spoke a lot about the idea of preferences and capturing those preferences and how a preference center can help, and really understanding the data that you're wanting to capture. And of course, you've got express data where people tell you very specific things, i.e. their name, their email address, their company name. And then you have implied data. So implied data is where you can look at the different pages that a person has navigated to on your website, and by that, you can imply a level of interest, for example. Same in relation to the emails they choose to engage with. The ones that they are engaging with and versus those they're not engaging with would imply a level of interest in what's happening there. So we look at both of those things. But today, we're going to look very much at the explicit data. So the things that people have told you and the data that you've actually captured. Now, this is really a segue from last month, as we said, is now that we've captured that information, what do we do with it? And so this month, we wanted to focus on the doing. And so the big part of the doing from a personalization point of view, besides obviously using field mergers within Eloqua, so that enables you to address somebody by name and understand their company name and use that potentially in a sentence. There's a whole range of field mergers, as you know. You can pretty much, well, you can merge anything from a contact and also from a custom object into an email. So that's one level of personalization. The other level of personalization is actually presenting different types of content, and that can either be copy in an email, or it could be imagery, or it could be a combination of two. So the biggest battle I find for customers sometimes is, first of all, having confidence in their data and thinking, are we going to present the wrong thing? Well, the message there is, well, yeah, cleaning of data is always something that we should be focusing on. It's not an end goal. It's just a constant journey to clean that data. The nice thing about dynamic content and also with field mergers is you have a default value. So if you have people going through and being sent a particular email that contains dynamic content, if they don't meet any of the rules that you create, then you can present a default message, for example. So the default can kind of be your saving grace if the data is incorrect or invalid for whatever reason. Okay, so you've got control over that. Don't think about dynamic content and think, oh, my data's no good. Honestly, you'll never get started if you keep saying my data's no good, my data's no good. You'll never get started. You've got to get started, and we're going to show you today how to maybe do some things in a simple way to give you the confidence to do that. Where to start? So, in relation to why you might use dynamic content, there can be all sorts of motivations. Personalization is obviously the big one. Sometimes I hear people talking about, well, I can build less emails if I use dynamic content. And yeah, generally speaking, you may well have fewer emails, few email assets. But look, the time involved in developing your dynamic content versus the time building multiple emails, look, it's kind of comparable. So I would never really look at dynamic content necessarily as a massive time saver. Look, it will save you time in some cases, but that's not the number one criteria for why you would use it. The number one criteria for using dynamic content is to increase the personalization of what you're doing. It can be really helpful, as I've said there, on nurture campaigns, because if you think about a nurture campaign that might have 10 or so emails that are delivered to somebody potentially over say a 4 or 5 month period, what you know about that person at the very beginning of that campaign versus what you know about them by the time they're halfway through that campaign or at the end of that campaign, hopefully there's more data that you've got. So that's where the defaults can kick in. So you may ask somebody what their first name, last name, and email address is, and that's enough to kind of get started with emails 1, 2, and 3. And then as you start to get to emails 4, 5, and 6, you might really find that if you've got industry information, then you're able to tailor it a bit further. Or in the case of a university, for example, if you've got a prospective student's primary course of study, if you know that, well, then you can start to really personalize the next emails in that nurture campaign. But if you don't have that information, well, that's where the default comes into play. And the default can help you carry that through and maintain it. But as soon as you do get that information and you do know their industry or you do know their primary course of study, then you're able to personalize further and you can just let the dynamic content take care of that for you as you move through. The other way that we use it a lot at Marketing Cube is often opening paragraphs in event invitations, for example. We may have all sorts of people coming to the event, different seniorities, from CMO to marketing directors to managers to individual contributors. The cross-industry one, usually for an event, is not so much of a play for us. It's more about where they are in that marketing world. So it's only one event, obviously. We're not putting on multiple events. It's just one event. But I want to make sure that the key points that would resonate for a CMO are delivered to the CMO versus to the marketing manager or an individual contributor whose motivations to attend might be quite different to the CMO. So yes, it's one event, but you want to make sure that the key points for those different audiences can be catered for. And so again, dynamic content can be really helpful there to have 4 or 5 maybe opening paragraphs to pitch, because that opening paragraph is the key. Once they've opened the email, that's the key to kind of get them engaged and looking a bit further. So as I've said there are all sorts of other ways that you can use dynamic content around industry, personas, sales stage. Are they a customer versus a prospect, or a prospective student versus the current student? Are they alumni? There's all sorts of other variables that we can use to deliver some dynamic content. Okay, so where can you actually use dynamic content? Well, it's a great question. So dynamic content can be used on emails and landing pages in pretty much exactly the same fashion. The only thing with an email, of course, is you've got the ability to alter subject lines and also the preview text. They can both be dynamic content. And so that's probably a really easy place to start from a dynamic content point of view, playing with different subject lines. So if you think about newsletters, some of those more regular type of campaigns that you get out the door, have a look at the audience, understand who's in the audience, and then have a bit of a play. And look, and I'm sure there's probably some healthy conversations happening around the water cooler at the office. Well, I think this subject line will be better. I think this one will be better, etc., etc. That's fine. Give them all a go. And play with the data and look at who could get which ones, for instance. And I'll show you here in a little bit how you can then actually evaluate the performance of each of those pieces of dynamic content in a single email as well. Okay, so creating rules. So the important part with dynamic content is you create a series of rules, and it's the rules that will determine who sees what. So let me give you a really basic example as I look at who's on the call with us today. So let's say we've got some people in New Zealand, and we have some people in Australia, and we have some people in Singapore. And we know that because that information is stored on the contact in the field called country. Very simple one. So what I could do there is create some imagery potentially that reflects those locations. So for Australia, maybe it's the Great Barrier Reef or a beautiful shot of Sydney Harbour Bridge or Ayers Rock, for instance, some iconic sort of locations around Australia. For New Zealand, it could be those spectacular mountains on the southern island that could be a nice backdrop to a banner, for example. And in Singapore, I always think about those beautiful big statues with the dragons and the water flying out of the mouth. I can't remember exactly where they are in Singapore, but that's kind of always an iconic symbol for me when I think about Singapore. So whatever those iconic images are, that will just add that little touch of personalization to a message. Can be easily done. So the rules in that case would be based on country. And if country equals Singapore, show this image. If country equals Australia, show this image, and New Zealand, etc., show that image. So very simple concept from that point of view. You can touch on just about anything. So you can look at anything on the contact. You can look at things in relation to custom objects as well. So there's a range of ways that you can develop the rules for your dynamic content. But one of the most probably one of the easiest places to start is an email. And an email, specifically the newsletter email, is usually the best one. The reason for that is that you may decide that you've got a single email going out the door, and that email may contain multiple messages and different articles, for example. And you know for a fact when you look at it that some of those articles are just not going to be relevant to potentially some of those customers. So let's say you have a static hero image. In this example, it's your banner for the newsletter. It's the same every month. That's fine. It's consistent. People like it. They get to know it. They're familiar with it, etc. However, the introduction, you could change based on a few variables. One is you'll probably have a default, but you may have a series of contacts. Let's call them X contacts and Y contacts. That could be anything from people in different industries or customers versus prospects. It could be anything. And so you use some dynamic content to just adjust the introduction to your newsletter and that little bit of a spiel. Then the primary article, that article that you kind of want everybody to see, regardless of who they are, it's the same. It's static. It doesn't move. It's just the same for absolutely everybody. They may then dive into a product or service that relates to a specific group of people. So, and I'll show you one here, an example. I'll show you an example here in a moment of one we've done just recently. And so only people with that particular product or that particular service will in fact see that next piece in the newsletter. It only relates to them. And in this case, the blank or the default will be blank. So what we do is we don't leave then a huge white gap in the email. Eloqua will just simply pull everything up from underneath. So it'll just simply flow visually. You're not going to end up with a big space or anything. Then you might have another one, which is another product or service. This time you want to have a default value. So you want to mix a default in there and present slightly different information to two groups of contacts based on different rules that you might set up. And then last of all, you might finish off with another static article. So regardless, everybody will see that last one. So all of a sudden, yes, what we're creating is a single email. So you're not creating multiple emails, which can be helpful. But what you're doing is delivering a far more personalized piece of communication to people versus everybody getting everything. Just not necessary. Okay. So for those of you who subscribe to our important or Eloqua important updates subscription, you're experiencing this every time because there's quite a bit of dynamic content that we throw into the important update email. And largely, it's driven on the pod number that your instance of Eloqua is stored on. And then it kind of breaks down to some of the app information. So in some of the app information, we have Zoom updates, for instance. Zoom apps are being updated for a range of different things. And so there are those who have told us they're using Zoom. And so it's that audience that will then shed just the Zoom updates with. So that particular piece of dynamic content there, you can see how it says the inserted component has no content. That means that the default value is in fact blank. So we're not going to see anything there. Okay. Now, if you adjust that little gray chevron that I've just highlighted there on the right-hand side, if you click on that, then what you see is the content that's on display. And in this case, it relates to a Zoom update. So as I said, we've collected information from clients who have told us they're using Zoom. And so we tailor this particular communication for them so they get that information and updates. Okay. And then this is what it looks like in the actual dynamic content itself. So there's the blank section. So the default rule. So you can see the little blurb in the center of the screen there. It says the default content appears for contacts who do not meet any rule criteria. And it's over there on the left-hand side of the screen that we start to create the different rules. And you can add multiple rules using that plus icon. So you click on the plus icon and you can just keep adding more and more rules. And here's what it looks like now with two rules in place. And this relates to Zoom. So there are a couple of locations in our database where people can tell us that. We may know that they're a Zoom client because we have that information stored at the account level in the CRM. So they've told us webinar platform, so that covers that. Or it might just be a lead that's not attached to an account, but they've also told us that they're using Zoom. And so we capture that information. And if you look at that interface, it probably looks familiar because really it's pretty much exactly the same as when you're building segments within Eloqua. It's the same sort of logic, the and or construct, and you can group different values just like you can in segments. So if you can build segments and play with rules there, you can do exactly the same thing over here in dynamic content. Now, on the right-hand side of the screen there, so you'll see 4 different areas. So this is where you're able to extract information from to help you create those rules. So contact fields, account fields, and custom objects. They're probably the 3 primary ones that you're going to be using on a fairly regular basis. The linked record in an event depends if you have the event module within Eloqua and if that's something that you use. If you do, then that's fine. You can access that as well. So what I want to do is just dive into Eloqua quickly and show you that in a little bit more detail so you can sort of see it live, so to speak. Okay. So here's that email that I was just showing you. And here's the Zoom section. So there's those little chevrons, right? So what happens is if the person does not have Zoom, then it just simply won't display for them. But if they are using Zoom, then it pops in like so. Then there's a few other pieces that we have. The rest are kind of fixed. The pod number, that one there. Yeah, so this one was dynamic content. So Oracle is slowly rolling out the new Oracle Analytics Server to replace the old Insight environment. And that information differed based on pod number. And so what we've done there is added different information to pit for people based on that. So if you have a look, if I click on edit, which is the dynamic content that I'm editing, you'll see here we've got account information and also leads divided up by pods. And we can see that the pod number, etc., is listed. So the rule is very simple in this case. And then just all the relevant information covered below. That's it. That one's really quite simple because it's just a simple single value. It's not a combination of values. That one's quite simple. Um, the rest is pretty static. This one also is dynamic in that if we know that you're a Salesforce CRM client, and obviously you're an Eloqua client, then what we do here is just give you some tips and reminders on a range of updates that happen to the Salesforce integration app. So again, just personalizing it because, if you're a Microsoft Dynamics client or an Oracle Sales Cloud client, for instance, you're probably not interested. You don't need to know that information. It doesn't do anything for you. So it's irrelevant for us to show it to you. So what we're trying to do there is just to personalize and deliver the content that is absolutely relevant for you. And then down the bottom, if we don't have pod number information, then this is a default. So this is a good example of where you want to use the default and you want to use the default with a value. And in this case, the value is, hey, look, we don't know your pod number. If we knew your pod number, then we could actually personalize this newsletter for you in a much better way. And so here, what we do is if we do know the person's pod number, then we can give them start dates and times, for example, as they flow through. So they're all the relevant pod numbers and the information that is provided. Pretty simple to put together and create. And the nice thing is, because we do this email on a regular basis, once you've developed those rules, while you can't create a dynamic content template, what you can do is go back and save as, which means all the rules are the same because the rules don't change from campaign to campaign in this example. Then what I do is I just rip out the content and pop in the fresh content for each month. So it's just a bit of a time saver from that point of view, and it's consistent as you're moving through. So that's what it looks like in the actual email. Okay. Now, the next one is dynamic segments. So what is a dynamic segment? Essentially, a dynamic segment enables you to have a segment active for the period of your campaign. So if your campaign is running for 3 months, then you'll initially create an audience and maybe use filters, or hopefully use filters to do that. Then you'll drop it on the campaign and there may be 600 people in there. You hit activate, and 600 people then start to move through the campaign. However, what the dynamic segment enables you to do is then create a schedule for Eloqua to actually go back and refresh that segment every hour, once a day, once a week, whatever you feel is appropriate. And it will then determine, are there any new contacts that now also meet the same criteria? If there are, let's bring them into the campaign as well. So if you think about newsletter subscriptions or lead nurture campaign, NPS segments, if you're doing NPS surveys using Eloqua, event registration campaigns, anything like that, the dynamic segment is a great way for you to then get those people into the campaign without you necessarily having to create a new segment every week, etc., as you go through that process. So what does that look like? And it looks exactly like this. So first thing you'll notice is that when you open up your segment and you double click and this little screen pops up, this option, the first one, is the one that is always selected, and that's the default. So it's to add members once when the campaign is first activated. If you choose the second option, it then also prompts you to select a reevaluation frequency. And that's what I mean by Eloqua will then go back on a regular schedule. That's the reevaluation frequency, to determine if anybody else now also meets the criteria. And if they do, then it will continue to bring those people through. Now, you may or may not have noticed on your campaign canvas that the segment is either, once your campaign is activated, it's either gray or it's green. If it's gray, that means you've selected the first option. And once it's gray, it's done. It's not going to do anything else. However, if your campaign is active and the segment is green, then that tells you that there's been a reevaluation frequency determined, and you'll be able to add additional people to that segment. And you can do that in a range of ways, by the way. You can use the filters within the segment to do that for you automatically, but you may also manually add people, go into the segment and manually add 2 or 3 contacts from your database to push them through. You could also upload an Excel spreadsheet if you needed to, maybe from an event. You've been at a conference of some sort and you have a list of attendees. You want to upload that group, for example, you could do that as well, all while the campaign is active without having to deactivate the campaign canvas. So just to keep that in mind. So, using those preferences to really personalize your campaign is the critical one based on the first party data that you've got. And that was definitely an emphasis last month and certainly before earlier this year in other user groups. So, the key thing is you don't want to use technology for the sake of using technology. I'm the last person to suggest that that's a good idea. Let's have a business case. Let's understand the value of what we're really doing. And I find the key driver for me when it comes to dynamic content is understanding the audience. So it's doing my creating my segment and applying my filters and getting my audience to what I want, and then actually drilling in and looking at the data and determining, is there a disproportionate number from one industry, for example, or do I have a disproportionate number of CMOs and marketing directors versus managers and individual contributors? What are they? And if I look at that and I'm like, you know what, there's enough people there, I think, that warrant me slightly adjusting the messaging for that group versus that group. Still the same email going out, but some dynamic content would really help. Subject lines, again, is another easy one to get started with. So think about that one. Places that you can experiment, as I said here, subject lines, preview text. Think about headings and the body copy, and even the calls to action that happen within your email. So you might want to use different language on a button, for instance, that you think appeals to one audience better than another. And we can report on all of this, so you can then not just experiment, but then actually apply some analytics to understand if your experimentation has kind of worked. So that's another good thing to do. So have a think about those things. Try and think about what, where, and how would be the best way for us to identify that. But let's have a look at some reporting. I've got a campaign open here. I want to show you here in a moment. But there are two specific reports that you can access for dynamic content, and you can look at it either at the campaign level or at an individual email level. So the campaign may contain multiple emails, all with multiple pieces of dynamic content. That's fine. You can look at it that way if you wanted to. I find I generally am drilling into an individual email to have a look. So that's probably the report I look at the most versus the campaign level. But let's have a look at what that might look like. So over here, here we go. So the report is called Dynamic Content by Email. And I might just zoom in there a little bit for you. Okay, so we've got first column is the actual name of the email itself, and you can see I've chosen the important update email that I just shared with you, email ID. Then the dynamic content component. So let's do these side by side, which will make it a bit easier to understand. So this is the email in question. So this email right here is this email right here. Then what I'm going to do is let's jump in and have a look at the first piece of dynamic content, which relates to Zoom. So if I open it up, you'll see we have a few things, right? We have dynamic content rules, and I've called it the Zoom client. So if we have a look over here, we've got dynamic content. Here's the name of it. So Zoom Events On Demand Canvas Feeder, Zoom Events On Demand Canvas Feeder. So there's two here. There's the default rule and Zoom client. So here we have the name up here, and we have default rule and Zoom client. Then if we have a look, we can see that 43 people in the campaign received the default view, and 40 were presented with the Zoom information. So you can see why we use the dynamic content. We have a number of clients using Zoom, right? Then I can see 12 unique opens for the default, 9 unique opens for the Zoom client, and I can see the actual email open ratio, etc. Now, there was really not too much to click through on. I think it was just really contacting support if there was any, and if people had any questions as such. So not a lot of click-throughs or no click-throughs at this point. There's not a lot to click through on this particular email. It's largely informational, and the primary calls to action are to contact support if you have questions. So it just means there's no questions at this point, or people are holding off on the questions. So yeah, I just want to show you the correlation between what you get in the insight report and what that looks like in the actual dynamic content. Okay. All right. The next thing that we wanted to talk about, carrying this little Olympic theme through from a visual point of view, was streams of communication and really using that first party data to tailor the engagement that you've got. So let's have a look. So personalization streams based on your first party data. Now, of course, the more data you've got, the better chance you have of actually personalizing campaigns. Now, we know that the appeal of personalization for marketers is pretty high. And you can see those here from a report from Epsilon Marketing and Sender Score, or the folks at Sender, is very and somewhat appealing is 90%. So most marketers kind of get that obviously this is something that I want to do and I want to personalize my communications. On the flip side of that, what you've got is 80% of consumers are more likely to do business with a company that offers personalized experiences. Now, in some cases, those customers may not even know that they're getting personalized experiences, but what they experience potentially is your messaging and content that kind of resonates with them and it feels like it's the right message, etc. And so that's you delivering more personalized content based on information that they've shared with you and profile data that you know about them. And as I was thinking about this, a number of years ago, there was a huge emphasis on mobile first. And some of you may be around long enough to remember, every the Foresters and the Deloittes, etc. Everyone was sort of saying, all the technology companies, obviously the Oracles and Salesforces, etc., and Adobes of the world, was mobile first, mobile first. Whenever you build an email, you must consider mobile first. And the primary reason for that was because everything had to be responsive. So if we designed it mobile first and it was responsive, then it would look gorgeous on a desktop and it would look fantastic on a mobile device. So it was really a great strategy. And I like to think, could we run with something like personalization first? It feels like too many syllables, but it works. Personalization first, right? Is that a position that we can potentially start to think about as we devise our campaigns and think about, well, what can we do to personalize this campaign further versus simply sending 45,000 people the same email? There must be something in the underlying data for 45,000 people that you could present something a little bit more personal to that particular group. Let's have a closer look. So identifying your major campaigns. And I wondered if this was one way, thinking about this concept of streams of communication. This is kind of the first step, and we'll move into a second step here in a minute, but I'm sure you probably do this yourself at the start of each year. You kind of look at your calendar. There are some always on campaigns, and maybe it's the primary lead nurture campaign is a great candidate for being, always on. Then you may start to map out newsletters, and maybe your newsletters go on a bi-monthly basis. And what you can do there, of course, is create that campaign to begin on the 1st of February and end on what do we have, 31 days in March? Yeah, I think so. So anyway, at the end of March, etc., and have the campaign live for that whole period, and then use a dynamic segment so that if someone subscribes to your newsletter at late February, they don't miss out and have to wait until April. They can actually be pulled into the existing current campaign and be sent the current newsletter. Okay, so that's why those dynamic segments are really helpful. Then you may have in-person events, and maybe they happen every second month, for instance. Then you may have multiple webinars, and maybe those webinars alternate against your events. So it's in person one month, online the next month, and so on as you kind of spread through the year. Then you may have onboarding campaigns. So thinking about either new customers coming on board or even new contacts coming into your database, which is probably more of a welcome campaign than an onboarding would. Typically, my language, I would say onboarding relates to customers coming on board, those people who are paying you something, versus people who are simply coming into the database, which would be kind of a welcome campaign, which probably then slips into the lead nurture campaign. Then you may have a reactivation campaign, again, an always on type of campaign, always looking to lift the engagement of those less engaged contacts that you've got in the database. Now, if we look at any one person, so an individual contact, say within one of those 2 month periods, and sort of the volume of email they can get and the types of communications or streams that they can be involved in, it's, they're getting a newsletter, and this month it falls into the in-person event. They're probably working their way through the lead nurture campaign because that's always on. So they may or may not have finished that one. And then maybe the following month, it's a webinar. These streams of communication are really helpful. But what we're trying to do is to personalize a little bit further. And so it may be that the event or the webinar is not super relevant based on what we know of that particular person. The topic maybe off message for that person. So we want to be able to include or exclude people, but we want to be able to understand who they are in order to do that. And so that's where this concept of a simplified persona can come into place. Now, for many of you on the call, you've probably got personas in place and have those functioning, and they could be complex and they could be not. Now, defining a persona, this one I find you can have intellectual debates as to what a persona is. So I thought I'd stick with the dictionary to give us an idea of what the persona is. What I thought was interesting was someone's character that is presented to or perceived by others. Okay, her public persona has been sold to millions of women as the ideal. Or Chris adds that his media persona does not match reality. Two different things and not news to us, right? We get it. But the idea of the persona to help us from a marketing point of view is kind of understanding an ideal potentially, and then trying to address our communications to that person that we think would resonate more so. Working on our Olympic theme today, I thought I'd choose some simplified personas. So we have swimmers, we have cyclists, we have athletics, and don't forget, Eloqua always provides you with a default. Okay, so we need a default in this scenario as well. So let's not get bogged down in any debates about personas. And you can say that these are arguably not personas, but we're looking at a simplified model here. Okay, so we're looking at a very simple model, and I'll explain here in a bit more in just a moment. So the point here is if we know a little, we can actually then deliver quite a bit or quite a lot more. Okay. And maybe it's one simple question. And this was part of the incentive to have you join us this month was, what is this simple question that we can ask? Now, the answer to the question is going to differ for all of you, but the question in and of itself, I think, is the same for all of us. And it's something as simple as which of the following best describes you? So this is really personal. It's on the mark. It's right to that individual. And what we provide them with responses, we don't want free text. Free text is not going to work. We need to present them with a single select pick list. Okay, not a multiple select pick list, but a single select pick list. So which of the following best describes you? Okay, so we've got the question. Now we need to figure out what the answers are. And so again, let's run with this whole Olympic theme. I was thinking, well, and there are loads more, by the way, that you could potentially put into this example, but these are the ones that we want to focus on. Okay. Imagine that list of answers is a single select pick list, and this is somewhere in your preference center is a good place to do it. It could be part of a welcome campaign. As somebody comes into your database for whatever reason, you then welcome them and invite them to share a little bit about themselves. And maybe this is the starting point. Okay. All right. So now we can start to look at simplified personas. And what I wanted to do there was show you that we can take, while we had multiple responses there, because swimmers probably don't identify themselves as simply a swimmer. I'm a 1500 meter. I'm a 400 meter. There's more specifics to it. So we give them that opportunity to tell us, and that's probably good information to capture. But whether they swim 1500 meters or 400 meters is not really going to change how you communicate to them, at least in this scenario that I'm providing you. So what we can do there is we can use Eloqua to do a little bit of magic in the back end to sort of roll up some information for us. So same with the cyclists. There's road cyclists, there's BMX freestyling cyclists, there's all sorts of cyclists. But at the end of the day, they're cyclists. And so what we want to be able to do is to convey certain pieces of information to that person based on who they are and this simplified persona that we've identified. Imagine now you're sending out a campaign and you've got all of these people in there and you've got against each of the different contacts, whether or not they're a swimmer, a cyclist, or if they're in athletics. And so what you can do now is think about the ability to control using dynamic content to present imagery that kind of supports that, right? So think about the ability to give instructions on, let's say it's the Olympics in Paris, looking at venue locations. Okay, I'm back. Not sure what happened there, folks. I apologize. Let me get back to where I was. Okay, so let me just revisit there. So simplifying personas. So the point was at this particular point, what we're able to do now is adjust our streams of communication based on swimmers. So we can use imagery in communications that relate to swimmers. We can talk about the venues, for instance. So where in the city of Paris is the accommodation? Where are the major swimming venues, etc.? Commuting from A to B, all that sort of stuff can be tailored based on the fact that we know this particular individual is a swimmer of some particular sort. So now we can do that. And in this case, I think when I looked at the Olympic website, there was something like 45 different disciplines. And then under each of those, so swimming being a discipline, and then under swimming, there was sort of 15 or more different categories, etc. So you can go that deep if you want to, but our point here today was to talk to you about the idea of a simplified persona and what a simplified persona might in fact look like. So hopefully that helps and gives you a little bit of an idea, and you're starting to think about those people you talk to on a regular basis, whether you're at university and trying to understand, am I a prospective student? Am I a parent? Am I a primary caregiver? Am I a high school teacher? Who am I? Am I a mature age student looking to go back and do some professional study? Is there one simple question that we can ask? If I'm providing in services to law firms, am I a partner? Are you a partner, a librarian? Are you an assistant clerk? What are you? What's the role that you play within that particular organization? Then you can use that information to tailor your relevant pieces of comms. Now, the other important part to throw into this exercise is where do you store that information? So, and this is probably more of a discussion that happens from an architectural point of view, is do we store that on the contact or do we store it in an Eloqua custom data object? Look, there's a range of reasons as to why you would do one or the other, but the fact is you need to store it somewhere so that you can use it, because as you saw earlier, we can use data from either of those two to drive the dynamic content rules that we need. So now that you know a little, you can deliver a lot. And so here are my points. So the imagery, the news updates can now all be tailored. Different events for the athletes, again, can be tailored. Personalizing accommodation choices, all of those things can now be personalized based on the fact that you know a little bit of information enables you to deliver a lot. Okay. We're just on 45 minutes. So just what I will just quickly jump into for you in relation to the Redwood experience. The key thing that I wanted you to be aware of is that by November this year, Redwood will in fact be the default for you. So when you log into Eloqua today, you have the ability to select an option to go with Redwood, or you can stay in the historical or the current, the old interface. But by November, that's going to switch. So by the time you log in mid-November, Redwood will be the default. So I really want to encourage you to make sure that you turn it on today so that you start to become familiar with it if you haven't already. So this is the previous interface of Eloqua, the My Eloqua screen. So the way that you access and turn Redwood on is very simple. Up in the top left-hand corner of the screen is the hamburger menu, just to the left of the Oracle logo. Click on the hamburger menu. Then the menu slides out, and at the very bottom of the screen, you'll see a checkbox with Use Redwood Experience. Simply check the box, and Shazam, you're in Redwood. Easy as that. The other one I wanted to just quickly make you aware of, and this is probably more for the administrators on the call, is there's been a new user profile created called Asset Manager. So the Asset Manager enables you to give people access and think about the people who are maybe creating your artwork and building and designing emails and landing pages, for example. And forms, this one is really designed for that group of people. So it may be a group of people who are not sort of in Eloqua on a daily basis to build campaigns and build segments and all that kind of stuff and launch campaigns. They're really just playing with assets, and they're keeping the team up to date and on brand and making sure images, etc., are on the mark. So, so this is just a simplified way to give that person the level of access they typically need in order to make that happen. And you can see some specifics there. So the asset manager grants them the ability to view, edit, delete, set security, and activate permissions. It's pretty broad, and if there's some training, I would encourage that there would necessarily need to be some training for that person as well. So you're kind of giving them a pretty chunky piece of access there. So it would be good for them to have a little bit of training along the way. And so, of course, if you need a hand with any of that, please reach out to us. We're more than happy to provide that training should that be required. Alrighty. Well, I'm going to stop there because we will use the user group the blog post to give you additional updates for 24C. We look forward to seeing you on the 4th of September. Thank you very much for joining us today. I'll stay on the line here for a moment if there are any other questions. Sorry about the little glitch earlier with the dropout. I'll see what's going on there, and look forward to seeing you in September. Thank you very much, everybody.